Good morning, faithful listeners. Welcome to the Bible Explained podcast on this lovely morning. We're going to be reading today about a queen that takes the throne in Judah and how she is probably the worst possible person that could have taken the throne. Stay tuned for that. So I completely forgot that this week is Holy Week. In fact, I forgot that Easter was coming up at all. I don't know what happened to my brain this year, but Easter was like the furthest thing from my mind. And so I didn't advertise any of my Easter things, even though I have quite a few Easter things available. So I'll just do all of that now. If you want a nice devotional for Easter, there's still time to get my Alive coloring devotionals. These are devotionals that I wrote and also illustrated, and they're a nice little gift for yourself or for your kids. There's a child's version too for Easter. And actually the child's version matches the adult version, so you can do them together, and the pictures are pretty similar, except the adult one has more like advanced pictures in it and more advanced devotionals. So you should check those two books out. Those are listed in the description of this episode under books. And when you click that link, it'll take you straight to Amazon, where you can purchase those two books, and they will arrive before Easter. So now that you know all about my Easter books, let's go ahead and read 2 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 12. This is the story of Athaliah. And if you guys remember Athaliah, she was the mother of King Ahaziah of Judah, who got killed by Jehu. We talked about that a couple chapters ago. So let's see what Athaliah does to retaliate against what happened to her son. I'll be reading this as I usually do from the WEB. Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal offspring. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were slain, even him and his nurse, and put them in the bedroom. And they hid him from Athaliah, so that he was not slain. He was with her hidden in Yahweh's house for 6 years, while Athaliah reigned over the land. In the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and fetched the captains over hundreds of the Kerites and of the guard, and brought them to him in Yahweh's house. And he made a covenant with them, and made a covenant with them in Yahweh's house, and showed them the king's son. He commanded them, saying, "This is what you must do. A third of you who come in on the Sabbath shall be keepers of the watch of the king's house. A third of you shall be at the gate sure, and a third of you at the gate behind the guard. So you shall keep the watch of the house and be a barrier. The 2 companies of you, even all who go out on the Sabbath, shall keep the watch of Yahweh's house around the king. You shall surround the king, every man with his weapons in hand, and he who comes within the ranks, let him be slain. Be with the king when he goes out, and when he comes in." The captains over hundreds did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded, and they each took his men, those who were to come in on the Sabbath with those who were to go out on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. The priest delivered to the captains over hundreds the spears and the shields that had been King David's, which were in Yahweh's house. The guard stood every man with his weapons in his hand, from the right side of the house to the left side of the house, along by the altar and the house, around the king. Then he brought out the king's son, and put the crown on him, and gave him the covenant, and they made him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, "Long live the king." So this lady, Athaliah, was the wife of King Jehoram of Judah, and she was also the daughter of King Ahab and Jezebel. And this Athaliah lady was absolutely terrible. It mentions her before, when Jehoram first married her, that she encouraged Baal worship in Judah and also helped her husband fall into sin. And then her husband helped everybody else fall into sin because her husband was the king. And her husband was King Jehoram of Judah, not of Israel, because there was a King Jehoram of Israel at the exact same time. And Athaliah was actually the sister of King Jehoram of Israel, and then the wife of King Jehoram of Judah. So it gets kind of confusing. And even I was a little bit confused when I first read this, because I was like, there's 500 Jehorams. Which one is which? So yeah, I was struggling a little bit when I first read this. But yeah, so Athaliah was the wife of King Jehoram of Judah. And she was also the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab. So she was a really wicked woman. She grew up in Baal worship. She was a pagan herself. And so when she becomes the queen of Judah, she starts incorporating Baal worship into Judah as well. And her husband just followed suit. Like they were totally cool with it. And then Athaliah also raised her son, who was king for a very short period of time after Jehoram died. She raised him to also be a Baal worshiper. And so Ahaziah continued in the sin of his mother and father. But then Ahaziah, who was going up to visit King Jehoram of Israel, his uncle, he got caught in the rebellion that took place in Israel, which we talked about in the chapter previously, where Jehu completely retaliated against King Jehoram of Israel and killed him and killed everybody even related or associated with the king in Israel. And one of the men that Jehu killed ended up being King Ahaziah of Judah. So now it says in verse 1 of 2 Kings 11, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal offspring. And like, I feel like most people might understand if a mom wants to retaliate against the person who actually killed her son. Like, I feel like people could understand that. But Athaliah didn't even do that. Instead, she went and killed her grandchildren. Anybody even related to her son. And why did she do this? Well, because she was a psychopath, first and foremost. She was an evil woman, secondly. And thirdly, she hated David's royal line. Because the royal line of David was the ones who were supposed to be kings forever. And since Athaliah herself didn't come from the royal line of David, she came from the line of Omri. She absolutely hated the line of King David. And so she gets up and immediately takes this opportunity, right after her son has died, to kill every single one of her grandchildren. She killed them all. It says that she destroyed all the royal offspring. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were slain. So the kings back in these days had many wives, and King Jehoram of Judah was no exception to that rule. He had several wives. Athaliah, it looks like, was his main wife, but he had other wives as well. And so one of Jehoram's daughters was named Jehosheba. And she was the daughter of King Jehoram and the half-sister of King Ahaziah. So she was a princess. But she was not the daughter of Athaliah. She was the daughter of one of the other wives of Jehoram. But instead of maintaining her status as princess, she was a Yahweh worshiper. And she went and married the high priest at the time, who we're going to be introduced to in just a second. So Jehosheba, a God-fearing woman, sees what her stepmother Ahaziah is doing and how she is killing all of the king's sons or any boy even related to the king. And so Jehosheba does something very brave. She goes against her stepmother and rescues a little boy, one of the sons of Ahaziah, named Joash. And this boy Joash would have been less than a year old. He was a little tiny baby, like an infant, just born. And according to Josephus, this little boy was actually found in the remains of the other king's sons, meaning that this little baby was possibly protected by the other king's sons who were being murdered. Or it could be that the person doing the murdering left the little baby alive for some reason, maybe out of guilt. I don't know. But it kind of does imply here in scripture that Jehosheba did find Joash near the remains of some of the other king's sons. It says in verse 2, but Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were slain. So to me, that does sound like baby Joash was hidden among the corpses of his brothers, which is really scary and sad. But Jehosheba, who maybe hears the baby crying, She finds the baby and she takes him, and she also finds the baby's nurse and takes them both and hides them away in a bedroom, is what it says. And this bedroom would have been most likely a storage area, somewhere that Athaliah wouldn't even think to look. And after she hides them in this bedroom, when it was safe for the nurse and the little baby to go out, she takes them both to the temple of Yahweh and hides them in one of the rooms of the temples of Yahweh. Now, you'll remember how the temple was constructed. It was basically like a big long box. And then on the outside of the temple, not on the inside, on the outside, there was a whole bunch of rooms that the priests could get to. And some of these rooms were rooms for the priests. Some were storage areas. Some were treasury areas. It just depended on, what was going on in Israel at that time. But Jehoshaphat takes the nurse and the little baby. And quite honestly, thankfully, that baby did have a nurse, right? Because how could that baby have been fed otherwise? But she takes the nurse and baby Joash and hides them in one of the rooms of the temple. And it says that she hid them there in Yahweh's house for 6 years while Athaliah reigned over the land. So Athaliah thinks that she was super successful. And she takes the opportunity that she just made for herself to rule over the land of Judah completely. And according to history, Athaliah ransacked parts of the temple to Yahweh so that she could use the materials, like the beautiful materials from the temple, to make the temple to Baal even more grand, even more beautiful. So according to history, she stole from Yahweh to give to her pagan idol. So it says in the 7th year, Jehoiada, who was the high priest and also the husband of Jehoshaphat. Yes, I know there's a ton of J names and it's hard to get them all straight. Jehoshaphat, Joash, Jehoram, Jehoiada. It's, oh my goodness, so many J names right now in this time in Israel's history. And it's really funny. I feel like, now that I've read a lot of the Old Testament with you guys, I feel like that happens sometimes where names sort of get really similar. And then all of a sudden they're super different because, history goes on and different names become popular or whatever in Israel. But right now, Israel's going through a J phase, apparently. So in the 7th year, Jehoiada, the high priest, sent and fetched the captains over hundreds of the Kerites and of the guard and brought them into Yahweh's house. And he made a covenant with them in Yahweh's house and then showed them the king's son. It mentions in 2 Chronicles 23, verse 1, that Jehoiada had to muster this courage in order to do this because Athaliah was a really wicked queen and would just kill people left and right. I mean, she had no sympathy for her own grandchildren, so she's not going to have sympathy for a high priest or basically anybody else in Israel if she can't even take care of her own children. And she was just a wicked queen, a murderer. And so Jehoiada, the high priest, had to muster this courage to actually do this because this was a very scary thing that he was about to do. It says that he sent and fetched the captains over the hundreds of the Kerites and of the guard and brought them into Yahweh's house and made a covenant with them. So what Jehoiada did was he went and gathered some captains into the temple of Yahweh to hide and to plan how to get rid of Athaliah from the throne. It says he made a covenant with these captains. So he told the captains, hey, look, I have something secret to show you, but I can't show you unless you agree to go along with this plan with me. And then Jehoiada, after making this covenant, making sure that these men were in agreement with him, he brings the little boy out, the proper king of Israel, who was only 7 years old at this time, but he was just old enough for the people to actually recognize him as a king. So he brings Joash out and shows them to all of these captains. And so Jehoiada commands the captains. He says, this is what you must do. 1/3 of you who come in on the Sabbath shall be keepers of the watch of the king's house. And 1/3 of you shall be at the gate Shur, and 1/3 of you at the gate behind the guard. And so you shall keep watch of the house and be a barrier. So they're talking strategy now of how to protect this little king, because obviously Joash, a 7-year-old boy, can't defend himself yet. And so these captains have to figure out where to strategically place their men in order to best protect the little king. And then it says, the 2 companies of you, even all who go out on the Sabbath, shall keep the watch of Yahweh's house around the king. You shall surround the king, every man with his weapons in his hand. And he who comes within the ranks, let him be slain. Be with the king when he goes out and when he comes in. So the strategic positions were made up of bodyguards. They were made up of escorts. And they were also made up of fighting men who could protect the king while they staged this rebellion against Athaliah. So then in verse 9, it says, the captains over the hundreds did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded. And they each took his men, those who were to come in on the Sabbath with those who were to go out on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. The priest then delivered to the captains over hundreds the spears and shields that had been King David's, which were in Yahweh's house. So I'm guessing these weapons were hidden in the temple in order for them not to be seized by Athaliah. I'm guessing, unless Athaliah went into Yahweh's temple and didn't search everything, or I don't know, didn't care, only took the really expensive stuff out of the temple so that she could make her Baal worship temple better. I don't know. But somehow Jehoiada still had some weapons left over from King David. And so he gave these weapons, these spears and these shields, to these captains so that the captains could distribute them to the men who they deemed worthy of them. It says in verse 11, the guard stood still, every man with his weapons in his hand, from the right side of the house to the left side of the house, along by the altar and the house around the king. Then they brought out the king's son, and publicly, it says they put a crown on him and gave him the covenant, in other words, a copy of the Old Testament law, and they made him king. And then Jehoiada, the high priest, anointed him, and the people all clapped their hands and said, long live the king. And this was purposeful. They were now presenting the king to all of Israel. So it says Jehoiada and all these captains surrounded little King Joash, put him up on something so that the city could see their new little king. And it says they put a crown on his head and gave him the Old Testament law to hold. And then Jehoiada, in front of all of the people, anointed the little king, and the people started cheering, long live the king, long live the king. And this would have caused a huge uproar, and people would have gone outside to see what was going on. What the heck is happening here? There's a king. This is crazy. The people would have been really excited, I'm sure, to actually have found a true heir to David's throne. But what's really interesting about this is the fact that the high priest hands a copy of the Old Testament law to little King Joash. And that shows something. It shows that Jehoiada was a godly man, a godly high priest who actually cared about the covenant of Yahweh. And since Jehoiada was one of the men who was helping raise Joash, we're going to find out he taught Joash pretty much everything regarding and relating to the temple and the Old Testament laws. So Joash was raised in the temple, and it's very likely he helped out in the temple as well when he could be kept under wraps, away from Athaliah's prying eyes. And plus, on top of that, Athaliah probably thought she was completely successful, so it's possible she didn't even know that there was an heir still alive. She likely thought that everybody had died, including little Joash. But Joash was raised in the temple, similarly to how Samuel was raised. You guys remember Samuel? He was raised in the temple from a very young age, from age 4 or something, and became the last judge of Israel. But as we're going to find out, children raised in the temple tend to follow God a lot more than children who are not raised in the temple. And that should tell you something. It's that the temple was good for the children. And to this day, even though we don't have a temple to Yahweh anymore, we have something else. We have the church. Children who are raised in the church, with both their parents teaching the children about church and about God, typically stay in the church even past adulthood. In fact, I have an interesting little graph here. It says 75% of kids leave the church from the ages of 18 to 29. But the 25% of kids that do stay within that age range were raised with at least one faith-focused adult in their lives, other than their parents. They served with their families in a ministry. They were entrusted with responsibility in ministry at an early age. And they had one spiritual experience in the home throughout the week. So that is what causes kids to actually stay in the church, is when their parents are active and are teaching the kids to be active in the church as well, which is exactly what happened with little Joash. Even though he didn't have a mother and a father attending church with him, he was raised by the high priest, most likely was given responsibility at a young age, was taught God's law at a young age, and was also taught the correct way to serve Yahweh. And as we're going to find out, Joash grows up to be a pretty good king. And he grows up to be a Yahweh follower as well, because of the things that he learned in the temple growing up. And faithful listeners, that's another reason why you should get the Alive Coloring Devotional for your kids. I just had to throw that in there. I was like, I didn't expect to talk about kids today, but it does tie in very well with the advertisement I gave at the beginning of this episode. So yeah, check out the Alive Coloring Devotionals for kids and adults. Faithful listeners, have a fantastic and wonderful rest of your day. Happy listening, and God bless.